Hi, I'm Victoria Peat and welcome to this video tutorial where I'm going to show you how to make this wonderful woven star quilt block. I'm going to show you the tools required, how to prepare your template, how to plan your colour schemes, and of course how to sew your fabrics to the template and construct the block. Right, so here are all the bits and pieces that I'm going to be using when making my woven cross quilt block. I'm going to be making a 6-inch finished size. So I've got the templates printed out, they're over 2 separate pages. On top of that, I have my add a quarter ruler, I have an 8 and an 1/8 ruler, a couple of rotary cutters. I've got some fabrics prepped. I've got what's this called? Craft knife, or you could have some paper scissors, a sew line glue pen, some pens for marking up the pattern piece, but you could use just a standard pencil or some coloured pencils. I have some pins that I'll be using when I come to construct the block. And I have my pressing surface. I've got a wool pressing mat, a small iron and a wooden clapper. I have an acrylic ruler and I have a small rotating cutting mat. It doesn't need to be a rotating cutting mat, but I like to use a smaller mat when I'm doing foundation paper piecing. I also have my sewing machine and a standard straight stitch foot. So when it comes to preparing your pattern pages, make sure that before you cut anything out or start sewing, you check this 1-inch test square. That's just to make sure that you have printed out your pattern pieces the correct size, because if you want to be making a 6-inch finished block, you want to make sure that once you've done all your sewing, that your block is indeed 6 inches finished. Just make sure that on your printer that you're printing actual size or 100% rather than scaling or fit to page, because that can just alter it a little bit and that will alter the finished dimensions of your block. So I have this printed out on standard printer paper, but the sample that I'm going to be sewing today is actually with a 50 GSM paper, which is a little bit thinner. You can, of course, use specialist foundation paper as well. But I find this 50 GSM paper quite inexpensive and it absolutely does the trick. It's really easy to use and it stands up well to foundation paper piecing. So I'll put a link to that in the comments section below. Right, so once you're happy that your pattern is the correct size, you can then cut out your pattern pieces. You'll see on the pattern that you have got solid lines and you've got a dotted line around the outside. The solid lines are going to be all of your stitching lines, and they're the guide for creating your shape. And then the dotted lines around the outside signify where your seam allowance is. So to prepare, what I do is I cut out the pattern pages around the outside of those dotted lines. I don't do it on the dotted lines, I do slightly to the outside. And I will do that either using my craft knife, or of course, if you don't have a craft knife or you'd prefer not to, then you can just use a pair of scissors to roughly cut out around the outside. Okay, so I'll just cut out all of those in the same fashion. Now I have on this particular design, you'll see here, the joy of this design is the way that the colours weave and create this beautiful shape with lots of movement. It's really lovely. But what you'll discover is that each of these quadrants are laid out in exactly the same way. You're making 4 exactly the same order. So you'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Same order, regardless of which quadrant you're doing. The difference is that, of course, it's your fabric placement. So on the pattern pieces, I have color coded each of the sections and I've named them A, B, C, and D just to try and help you pull all of those together. And the other thing I do have for you included with your instructions is a colouring page. So what I've done is I've taken my colouring page and I've decided this time, I work frequently with bright colours and white backgrounds, but I've decided this time it might be quite nice to do a lilac background and a selection of green fabrics. So I've gone ahead and I've coloured in on my colouring page how I would like that to look. I spent a bit of time looking at some fabrics and deciding which ones weave in with which and what I think is going to create a nice effect. I've then gone and coloured in my colouring page to help signify which parts are which. I can then transfer that onto my pattern pieces. What you'll notice though with foundation paper piecing is that your pattern pieces are the reverse of what you see on the colouring in image and what you will see in your final block. So this section here is section A, but this is what your pattern piece for section A looks like. So it's the reverse of what you see here. So what you do is you colour in your colouring in diagram, and then you can transpose those markings onto your pattern pages, onto your pattern pieces. So I've got here A4, I've used a yellow pen, and down here I've coloured in with my yellow pen because I've chosen yellow, and I've written light green. So on my pattern piece, I would then write light green, or I would do a little squiggle, or I would just be happy knowing that the little triangles equal the light green fabric. And then I will go ahead and do, what else have I got here? I've got the dots. So A2 is dots, and you'd write dots, or do a squiggle, colour it in, do whatever you need to. Now the background fabric here, I've not put any key on the background here because it makes the pattern piece quite fussy. So I've just left those blank. So in my mind, I know that if I see these blank pieces, I know that I'm going to be using my background fabric, which is what I've chosen to be the lilac. So as I mentioned a moment ago, I've gone ahead and created the other 3 quadrants, and I'm going to just show you this one here. Each quadrant is made up of 5 different pieces, and I've coloured those in, of course. So what I do here is I start with piece number 1, and then I work my way through the numbers D2, D3, D4, and D5. It's like paint by numbers, just work one piece at a time. All of the pieces are added to this template. We're going to be sewing through the template to add the fabrics. Each of them are going to be added the same way, except for the very first piece. So once you've got your head around the first piece and the second piece, it's then easy sailing. Okay, so what I need is to attach the first piece of fabric to the reverse of my template. And the piece of fabric that I need, just grab a pen, needs to be the size of my square, plus I need a quarter of an inch around each side. So this side is easy. That's shown for you already here on the outer edges. Those are already shown. So you just have to imagine what your quarter of an inch seam allowance is going to look like on these outer edges. And you get your eye in. When you've been doing this for a while, you start to see or envisage where that quarter of an inch will be. So you've got your main shape plus a quarter of an inch around the outside. Now you can measure that and cut a square the right size. I always prefer to go a little bit larger. So you can see here, if I line that up, the quarter of an inch starts here and finishes here. And I've just given myself sort of an 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more than that, that extends a little bit further on each side, just to give me a little bit more wiggle room. Okay, so this first piece of fabric needs to be attached to the wrong side of the template. So I'm going to put a bit of my sew line glue pen on the reverse of the paper template underneath section 1. I then need to attach this to the piece of fabric to the wrong side of this piece of fabric. And when I place it, I'm just making sure that the fabric extends further than the seam allowance on all 4 sides. So it extends further down to the left, there's fabric to the top and to the right. I think I might just shift a little bit further to the left, just to make sure I've given myself enough room. Now this 50 GSM paper is great because I can see the shadow of the fabric through. If you can't, or you're using a thicker paper, you can shine this up to a window, shine it up to a light, and you'll see the shadow of the fabric shining through. You might also have a light box. If you do other crafts, then a light box is great for this purpose. So that's piece number 1 in place, right side facing away from the paper, and the paper's attached to the wrong side of the fabric. We then need to get ready to join piece number 2. So to do that, what we're going to do is fold back between D1 and D2 along this stitching line. Okay, now to fold back, I use my Add an 1/8 ruler plus, And we have an add a quarter ruler and an add an eighth ruler. And these are acrylic rulers that have a little lip on one side. So down this long edge, you've got a lip. On this one, it's a quarter of an inch. This one, it's an eighth of an inch. The plus means that this is actually wider than this one. This is just a standard add a quarter ruler. This is an add an eighth ruler plus this extra section here. And this section is actually thinner at one edge than it is at the other. And what that allows you to do is fold back along this edge, makes it easier. If you don't have a plus ruler, either add a quarter plus or an add an eighth plus, don't worry, you can use a thin piece of cardboard, something like a postcard, works absolutely brilliantly. So you'll place your cardboard or your ruler against that line, lift the paper, leave the fabric touching the cutting mat, and you're just running your finger on the underside to fold back along that stitching line. What you then need to do is to trim back this seam allowance. What you don't want in foundation paper piecing is too much fabric within your quilt blocks because they get really bulky, particularly if you're working on something a lot more complex. So on this size block, I'm going to trim my seam allowances back to a quarter of an inch. But if you're working on a smaller one, like I did on this one here, this is 2 inches finished. I trimmed all my seam allowances back to an eighth of an inch because it's too complex. The piecing is too small. So reducing to an eighth of an inch is much better. So you take the ridge on your ruler and you slide that against the fold in your paper. You can then take your rotary cutter and trim away this excess piece of fabric, and that's now removed from your block. So this is now this seam allowance prepared with a quarter of an inch. Now, piece D2 here, I've written is linen texture, so that's this green fabric I have here. And this is the shape of it with the dots on it. So I'm just going to, I can see through quite nicely because this is the 50 GSM paper, but I'll just draw it just in case you can't see it clearly on the video. This is the shape of D2, the finished shape. So you need to take into account that you need a piece of fabric that also includes the seam allowances. So you've got your seam allowance here. You'll also have your seam allowance running along this short edge. You can see through the paper the dotted line for the seam allowance on the outer edge, and you'll need a seam allowance here. So for each of these stripes, I have measured the width of the stripe, added a quarter of an inch on either side, plus a little bit more, just to allow myself plenty of space when I've cut these strips. Then what I'll do is I will take this and I will place these fabrics right sides together. So from piece number 2 onwards, you're laying your fabric right side facing uppermost, and you're taking your piece that you're working with and you're placing it on top. And when you place it, because we've trimmed this quarter of an inch seam allowance nice and straight, you can place that against a straight edge on your fabric. Just make sure when you're placing that the fabric, as we did with the first time round, that your fabric is extending left and right and towards you far enough so that it would stick out. So if I lift this up, you can see the dotted line here. If I lift that over, you can see that the fabric extends far enough out and enough to the right-hand side. So once I'm happy with that placement, I can then pick this up between my fingers and take it across to the sewing machine. So as I mentioned at the start, my machine is set up with a standard straight stitch foot. What I'm also doing is reducing my stitch length to a 1.7. When I turn my machine on, I think it's a 2.4, so I just reduce that a little bit, because what that stitching does is that will perforate the paper, which means that it's easier to remove later. So when I've arrived with my fabric, I'm just making sure that these raw edges are matching. Sorry, that was sort of fingers and thumbs. So I'm just making sure that these raw edges are matching. And then I am sliding my fingers underneath this folded piece of paper here and flipping that over. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch on this line here. I'm going to start just a couple of stitches into this seam allowance. Using my hand crank, I'm just dropping the needle into the down position. and then lowering my presser foot. And all you do is stitch on that line. When we get to the end of the line, you can see there's this line running across perpendicular. I'm just going to sew up to that line and then maybe 1 or 2 little stitches just beyond. There's no need to backstitch. So you can see here I've done a couple of stitches at the start along the line and a couple of stitches just to the other side. Then we press. First of all, I like to press my stitches flat because that just beds the stitches into the fabric, and then that warms the fabric up nicely, and then I can pull the fabric back perpendicular to my line of stitching. I'm not really pulling, I'm just guiding it across, if you like. Not too tough, not too strong in either direction. Don't pull too much to the left or the right. You want to go entirely perpendicular back against that line of stitching. You don't want to add any little pleats into that seam. Allow that to cool. You don't have to use a clapper if you don't want to. I just like the finish it gives. So there we have piece number 1 and piece number 2. Because we're working in order, we'll just go round and go 1, 2, and 3. So this time we are joining a background piece, and I'll take my postcard or add an 1/8 plus ruler, again leaving the fabric where it is, sliding my finger along that line to lift the paper over and fold it back. Then take your add a quarter ruler, and if you don't have an add a quarter ruler, don't be put off. You can use an acrylic ruler. Place your 1/4 inch line against the fold on the paper and then trim away the excess. The challenge that you'll get by using an acrylic ruler is when you are dealing with more complicated blocks, it doesn't sit flush on top of the block because you've got all the bundled seams and the seam allowances. So the lip on this just allows you to be super accurate on the side, and it's just easier to use because it doesn't cover the whole of the block. So I highly recommend using these. Right, the next piece of fabric was a background, and I've prepared a triangle here. So this one's nice and easy. You have a triangle, you've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance across the top, and then your seam allowances along these 2 sides to create this point. So if you just measure a square, so if you take your ruler, measure a square, and then you can cut that in half to create 2 triangles. You'll have one for this part here and one for here. So place this right sides together, place it nice and centrally. You can eyeball that you've got about the same amount coming out either side, and just double check that where it comes to the point of the triangle or the corner of the block, that you're just making sure that this extends enough outwards. Take it across to your sewing machine. Again, make sure these raw edges are matching. Flip open the paper. This time we're going to be sewing through the seam allowance, and I'll draw that. You'll be able to see your fold line, and you're following that fold line. We're going to stitch all the way through the seam allowance along the line and through the seam allowance at the other end. And what that will do, you'll see as you stitch, is that will cover the start of the stitching line that you did when you joined piece 1 to piece 2. So that will just secure those stitches. So we've gone through the seam allowance, along the line between 2 and 3, and then through the seam allowance at the other end. Press it flat, set the stitching, pull back, and then you've allowed it to cool. We'll then get into the habit of counting 1, 2, 3, piece number 4. Now, whilst we're looking at something relatively simple here design-wise, when you get to more complicated designs, it's really important that you don't lose track of where you're up to. Okay, D4, again, we're folding back along the line that allows us to attach D4. Then we're going to use the add a quarter ruler to trim off the seam allowances. So we're trimming seam allowances on 2 different parts here. Get rid of that from our block. Making a mess there. And piece number D4 is dark green. So I've got my dark green fabric here. I'll draw on again so you can see the shape. Some slightly longer piece. Oh, drawn a bit wonkily. So there's your piece here, and then you need your seam allowance that runs along here, and along there. So it's actually a relatively large piece of fabric required. I'm going to put that on my fabric, that straight edge on the straight edge of piece of fabric, just making sure on this left hand side as I look at it that my fabric is big enough, which it is just, only just. I'm going to smidge it across a little bit. So whilst I've drawn this 1/4 inch seam allowance, one, it's not very accurate, and two, I know that I'm going to be adding piece D5 at a later stage, so that works fine. It's more important for me to make sure that I've got fabric that covers this corner. Back across, slide my hand under, flip the paper open, and then I'm going to go through the seam allowance on this side. All the way down. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop just beyond this line, because I know that when I come to attach D5, I'm going to stitch through the seam allowance here and here. So this line of stitching for D5 will cover the end of this line of stitching that I'm doing. And if I go too far into the seam allowance, it makes it difficult to fold back. Just using the tip of my iron, pushing that back along. And now we're ready to trim that back and add our final piece, which is D5. So fold back along the line. Trim off. And add right sides together. Through the seam allowance, along the solid line, and then through the seam allowance at the other end. So you can see it's a nice rhythm that you get yourself into. And I like to stand when I sew, although my back would say otherwise this morning. I think I slept weirdly, but yes, I stand when I sew, and I find it really easy to have everything all set up together because the processes are repeated so frequently. I have everything together, and it makes it an efficient way to work. So there we have the block is all pieced. I will double check that I have got all of my solid lines have been, all of the solid lines inside the outer box have been stitched on, and I have got all 5 pieces added. So my design is going to look like it intends to when I'm finished. What I need to do is I need to trim this up so that it looks like my other ones, and then that allows me to add this to those blocks. So to do that, I need those. I need my acrylic ruler, and I use an old rotary blade that is no good for cutting all my good fabrics, but it works absolutely brilliantly for trimming my pieces. So again, another reason why I use a smaller mat, a rotating cutting mat, something else that isn't my main mat, because I find that when you're cutting through the paper and several layers of fabric, you're exerting more pressure, and it puts too much wear and tear on the main mat. So take the acrylic ruler, find your 1/4 inch line, place that 1/4 inch line up against the solid line on an outer edge of your pattern piece. When you do that, you'll find the outer edge of your acrylic ruler lines up with the dotted lines on the outside of your section. Make sure that your hand that's holding the ruler is nice and firm on top of your pattern section so that nothing slips around, particularly with those more complex blocks. They can be quite bobbly and unstable. So just be nice and firm. Okay, so that's my section all pieced and trimmed up, and now that's ready to be added to these extra pieces that I've already done. So when it comes to joining these sections together, there are instructions and guidance for you in the PDF download. But what you're essentially doing is you're joining two sections together to create two halves, and then you're going to join those two together. Now it says join A to B and C to D and then join those two together, but you can join this way or you can join this way and join together. It doesn't really matter. What does matter, if you like, is matching your seams. And for this block, it's really nice if you can get this point here where the woven sections join to match. It just looks nice and smart. And if you can get this point here in the middle to join at the right point as well, again, that one looks really lovely. So those points are all marked on the instructions for you. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these two first, and then I'll repeat the process. So the areas that I want joining when I'm joining these two together, this is the main one that I want to join. I'm also going to make sure that they're joined together at this end and at this end, but this is the most important point. So I'm going to start off with using my pins. I'm going to put a pin on the seam line between this C4 and C5. I'm just going to stick that through. And then I'm going to look on this side and just make sure that it is coming out exactly on the line between those two sections of fabric. I'm then going to pop in another pin at the corner on this edge and one on the corner here. There we go. So I've got 3 in there. I'm then going to do the same thing on this side. Got a pin between on this one. I'm doing A. I mean, I'm all over the place here. Doesn't matter as long as you're creating a design that you're looking for. So I'll stick through that junction between those two pieces, just making sure that's coming out in the right place this side. And again in this one corner, and then a third pin this one. And then I'll just bring it back just to make sure that I'm not accidentally sewing them this way. I'm going to make sure, just doubly make sure. And look, I've put the pin in the wrong place. So I've put the pin here, whereas actually I need the pin further down. There we go. So those are matching. I'm then going to take these and I'm going to be adding them right sides together. So I'm going to bring them together, right sides together, but I'm going to take out one pin at a time. So I'm going to place my finger at the base of this one here, because for me, this is the most important section. I'm going to take the pin out and I'm going to take the pin on the corresponding section and I'm going to place that through the hole that's been left. And you should just about be able to see that hole. If not, hold your work up to the light because you'll be able to see a lot better. So I now have a pin that's going through both of these sections. I'm then going to go across to this corner, take out the pin from the bottom piece. Again, I've got my finger at the base of this pin, take that one out, and then I'm going to post the pin from the top pattern piece through that hole. And then go along to this third pin here. Again, finger at the base, take the pin out, take the pin from the top section and pop it in. So when I push those pins all the way through, they should all run perpendicular to the pattern pieces, and your pattern pieces should match up on these edges. Now, who's to say that you don't just put these two pattern pieces right sides together and sew? But for me, because it's important for me to have this point matching, I just make sure that I've got that pin in there, and then I know that those two pieces are exactly on top of each other. I now need a couple of sewing clips. And then I'll place my sewing clips along the seam, and I'll put a couple either side of that pin in the middle, and I'll just do a couple more. Try not to poke yourself with your pins. So I've got that secure, and then I'll take out the pins, because you can't get them through the sewing machine with the pins still in. Now you could, if you wanted to, you could, instead of using sewing clips, you can weave your pin through, but I find that that shifts things out of place a little bit, so I do prefer to use sewing clips. So back across the machine, I tend to start with my needle in the down position, and then we're going to be sewing along this outside edge. So I will put my pattern piece underneath the presser foot, and I'm lining up the line that I'm going to be stitching on with the center of my presser foot. When I'm happy that's in the right place, I'll drop my presser foot, and then I'll just hand crank a little bit, and then I'll sew along that line. If ever you're not sure and you're piecing something that's more complicated, you can always stitch with a longer stitch length. Have a look at your work, see if it matches, and if it does, you can go back in and stitch again with a smaller stitch length, because if you've done a row of really tiny stitches and it's not right, it's a real pain to have to unpick those. Okay, so that's my line of stitching that's gone through the seam allowance, along the solid line and out the other side. And with a bit of luck, it's pretty much along the line on the other side. Then when you open it out, you would hopefully get this section here matching nicely. From here, I will place my pattern piece with the fabric facing the pressing surface, and I'll just open out this seam allowance and use the tip of my iron to press those seam allowances open. You can press to one side or the other, and some blocks do sit better that way, but I find this block works better if the seams are pressed open. So press that open from that side, and a quick one from this side. Now, a quick note on ironing with foundation paper piecing is that these blocks can get quite bulky, and some of the fabric sits more proud. And if your iron has got any dirt on it at all, you can bet your life that it will leave a grubby mark on those bits that are sitting nice and proud. So do make sure that your iron's nice and clean. Okay, so to help this sit flatter and in preparation for sewing to this other pair, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the paper from the seam allowances only. So I'll open this out and then very carefully fold and remove the paper. Now I'm not using a pulling action in that I'm not pulling away. I'm doing it almost like you're tearing stamps off a sheet. So you're using that perforation. Makes me sad that I think people won't know what stamps are one day, because they're all, well, certainly in the UK, they're printed stamps so often these days. So just be careful, you don't want to pull on your stitches. I stuck a bit of glue on that, so that's a bit stuck. There we go. Stuck in there. Right, so once I've taken those bits out, just on the seam allowances, I'll then give it another press to flatten it back down again. Just allows you to get a slightly flatter block by removing that extra paper. And I'm going to allow that to cool, and I'm going to repeat exactly the same process with the other two pieces. So those are my two pairs sewn together, and then I can sew these together to create the final block. Now this time we're looking to make sure that these two sections are matching, these two, and of course the central section as well. The outer edges also, but if they're out by a little smidge for some reason, you can always true that up and make allowances for that. But my aim is to see if I can get this center seam to match, then these ones, and then these ones come in third place. Now, when we come to sew these together, we're going to place them right sides together. I'm going to do the same thing with the pins, and we're going to be sewing along this edge here. Now, once we've sewn this in, this means that these two little bits of paper here, just in this section, these ones become more difficult to remove once you've stitched across. So I like to just tear this little bit of paper out. I leave most of the template in to provide that stability, but I'm just going to take those little bits out. Anything for an easier life. Okay, right, so just flip it over just to make sure. You don't want to accidentally sew the block together like this. So always bring it back to the layout that you're looking for. And now I'm going to stick my pins in. So I'll stick a pin in this corner. It's just catching a little bit. It's better. Then I'll do this central one. Now, because you've got your seam allowance folded open, it's a little bit more tricky to see exactly where you're supposed to be putting your pin. So I'll take my pin like this along the length of the seam line, and then I can see where I'm placing it. What I'm talking about is placing the pins. I know it's going to seem really pernickety, but you can maybe just see that I've caught a little bit of this lilac fabric with my pin. So I know I need to just shift my pin a little bit further to the left-hand side. Just creates that little bit of sharpness. That's better. Okay, so let me join these two central sections, the center point first. And again, test it on your fabric first, make sure that you know that it's going to come out. But if you want to, you could always just mark a little point to show you where the pin's going to come out, because when you've joined the two sections together, when you take that pin out, there isn't a hole in the same way that there is when you take the pins out elsewhere, because you're not poking through fabric, you're poking through the seam allowance. So it's sometimes a little bit more tricky to see. So take your pin out, post your other pin through. And do the other sections. Let's just come out. And then my last one, I'm just going to look to the light. So now I can go in, add these pins, sewing clips, and in the center point, I'm just making sure that that pin's running perpendicular. And I'm going to clip with the aim of getting it on top of the seam allowances to hold those flat, so that when it goes through the sewing machine, I'm not accidentally folding one back on itself. Because if you do that, then the block's going to be just that marginally less flat. And the point of having a flat quilt block is, one, it looks nicer. It makes it easier to quilt over the top of. You want to make sure that you don't have unnecessary bolts. Okay, Right, when I'm happy with that, I'll take my pins out. And again, if you're not so confident, you're not sure, or you're working on a more complicated, bulky block, do stitch with a longer stitch line, stitch length first, and then you can always go back in and stitch again. So over one point. And there you go. So I've done through the seam allowances on either side and all the way along that solid line. So when you open it out, you can see that I've got my points, well, you'll see better when I've pressed that this point's matching. This point is just about, oh yes, that's looking okay. And then the center point. So I'll be happy with that. Again, just going to press this open, and then I'm going to go in and take that paper out just so that it lies a bit flatter. One half and the other. A little press from the top. Oh, it looks so nice. Remove this paper. Now I would leave the rest of the papers in until I've got this block incorporated into whatever project I have in mind. So whilst I worked with pre-prepared fabrics that were mostly cut on the grain, the paper will just give it that stability. So wait until you've sewn it into pillow, a cushion, a pouch, into a sampler quilt, however you're going to use it. I would make sure it's sewn around those outside edges before you start to take your paper out. There we go. So let me press that again. And normally what I would do is I would give that a good press, warm up all the fibers, make sure it's nice and tidy, and then I'd probably just trim off these excess bits here. And then I would lay it underneath an acrylic ruler and underneath something heavy, just to let all those fibers set again and make it wonderfully neat and tidy. So there you have it. There is the woven cross. I hope you've picked up some good tips and techniques both for foundation paper piecing and the planning for doing foundation paper piecing. If you do make one, let me know how you get on. Leave me a note in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and keep up to date with all my other YouTube tutorials that are coming out to help guide you through patchwork and quilting. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.